All right, good evening, everybody. Great. It's good to see you all. And it actually, when this series was, you say, portioned out to teach, if you're teaching a series and it's Hebrews, almost everybody will want to teach Hebrews chapter 11. So I'm privileged. So it's a blessing to some extent to be able to sort of share insights on Hebrews chapter 11. But then at the same time, I'm sure we all know that there's so much in Hebrews 11. It's the chapter that's called the Hall of Fame. And just as when you go maybe to a museum and you see different pictures, it's like a picture, and within that picture there's a story behind it. And with the book of Hebrews, chapter 11 in particular, there's so many stories that it links to that I'm sure that you are all aware of. And because of that, it is going to take about 5 hours before for us to be able to go through. No, not. So basically, because of that, I'm just going to really do more of an overview. And I've designed some questions that hopefully can really help us to not just talk about the academic side of this chapter, but more how it applies to our own lives. Yeah, so Hebrews chapter 11 is a very interesting chapter. But let's first of all do an overview of where we're coming from. In chapters 1 to 4, we know that the Hebrew writer is writing to Jewish Christians. And he's been setting up the scene. If you just hold on, please. If you just hold on, we'll give it at the end. What he's done is he's talked a lot about the supremacy of Jesus Christ. In chapters 1 to 4, he makes strong references to the fact that Jesus is superior to the angels and that he is the living word of God. In chapters 5 to 8, he emphasizes how Jesus is a high priest and how that we have a high priest who goes to into see God once and for all. And then in chapters 9 to 10, he talks about how Jesus is the perfect sacrifice. So that's where he's coming from, just to bring us up to speed. And then in chapter 11, he now talks about what faith really is. And what we're going to find is that, faith is a lot about trusting God. And how it really demonstrates is not on what we say, but it's on what we do, isn't it? And it reminds me of a story, whether it's a true story, I don't know, but it was a denomination that had a conference. And this conference that they had different speakers that were going to speak. And I think it was on a Saturday. There was a very excited, zealous member who wasn't one of the speakers, but he had good relationships with the speakers. And then towards the evening, one of the main leaders in this denomination went up to that young, zealous guy and said, "You know what? The person who was supposed to speak tomorrow morning, unfortunately, has fallen sick. So you need to do the talk. How about you doing the talk?" And he's like, "Oh, no, I can't." And then he looked at him in the face. I said, "Come on now, you just got to trust God." So this young, zealous guy prayed about it, thought about it, and then the next morning was still looking around. And then at breakfast time, the mature person that spoke to him the day before had left his Bible on the table. So he went to his Bible and he opened it up and he saw his sermon notes for the main talk for that evening. So he looked at it and went to a corner and did his own sort of homework on it. And that morning, he did a fantastic job with the sermon. But the elderly guy that's my sermon! And so at the end of the speech, when everybody was giving him a round of applause, he went up to the young guy and said, "Man, what have you done? What am I going to preach?" And the young guy just looked at him in the face and said, just trust God. Just trust God. So let's look at Hebrews chapter 11. And if we can get somebody just read from verse 1 and 2, please. So this is a very, very familiar passage. You know, King James or NIV, faith is the evidence of things hoped for. You know, in some cases, the conviction of things not yet seen. So in some versions, the certainty of things. You know, there are different words that are used, but when we go back into the Greek, you know, the first thing, I think, the first point for us to highlight here is that this actually is not the definition of faith, but it is a description of faith. It's one of the key descriptions of faith. And if I also ask any of you, you know, what is it that we are hoping for? Anybody? Yes.
The gift of eternal life.
Exactly. It's eternal life. You know, and I think it's important for us to remind ourselves that that's what this passage is really talking about. That, you know, because when we talk about faith, you know, faith to get that job, faith to, yes, that's true, and we use this passage as well, you be certain and sure, but in this particular case, it is about the overall package. You know, it's about what God has blessed us with. And the link, actually, why? And remember that in the scriptures, when they were written, there were no chapters. So we have chapter 10, and then we look at chapter 11. But if we were to just look at this as a flowing letter, if we look at chapter 10, verse 34, it was a key link to this chapter, because in verse 34, I read, it says, you sympathized with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So do not throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. You need to persevere so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what has promised. For in just a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith. So the writer here is saying that, look, you guys are drifting, going back to the old ways, thinking about the Jewish ways as the right thing. Don't forget what you've actually even sacrificed, the things that you've gone through, where you used to believe. And I think for us, you know, there is a tendency sometimes for us to look back at the good old days. Isn't that true? You know, oh, I remember those days. I was hot. You know, in those days, shh. And we look at those days and we say, I was so on fire for God. But what about now? And in a way, that's what this the writer is saying. Don't throw that away. You know, there were things that we've done in the past, but what about now? And so he gives us a description of what faith is. The other thing, just to mention in Hebrews 11, is that the word that is used is actually a description of, in business, what they used to call like a title deed. So when he talks about the assurance, if you've got NASB version, it uses the word assurance. In some new NIV versions, it talks about an assurance as well. And that actual word is actually saying a title deed. So our faith is not something that is we wish for. It's something that, you know, is actually ours. It is almost like our right. And the reason also, the way it talks about hope, the way hope was used in those days was not some mythical thing that you're sort of looking forward to maybe. There was a certainty about it. And that's what we need to remind ourselves about, that what God has promised us is certain. But do we really believe it? That's a question that we need to ask ourselves. So what the writer then does, like any good sermon will have, it will have illustrations and it will have examples. And so he then goes to demonstrate, okay, this is what the faith that we're talking about, this is what it looks like. You know, when you do an illustration, you're trying to help the people to sort of put sort of like flesh and bones. Okay, this is what it looks like. You know, trying to make it real to them. And so he goes into the lives of different people. So if somebody could please read from verse 3 to 12, then we'll look at that. Anybody? Yeah, Rob? Thanks.
By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what was seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear, built an ark to save his family. By faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land, like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was able to bear children, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so, from this one man, and he, who was dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and as countless as the sand on the seashore.
Amen. Thank you. So there's a lot in there, as you can see. Oops, the reason why I'm going to spend 5 hours. So the second point, when we're looking at all these examples, I think the theme that what we can see here is that faith is not about seeing with our eyes. Faith is seeing with the eyes of our hearts. And when we look at all the examples, he actually uses the word that they saw something, but what they were seeing was through the eyes of their hearts. And if we look at all the examples, for instance, even he starts off with, by faith we understand that the universe was formed. And then he goes into Abel. By faith, Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain. If I also ask, both of them offered a sacrifice, what do you think was different? Why is it that God accepted Abel's and didn't accept Cain's? Anybody?
Cain was the firstborn.
Cain was the firstborn?
That's one of the items was maybe.
Okay.
He gave the best of his fruit. He gave the best of what he had to God.
Who, Abel or Cain?
Abel.
Abel gave the best. Okay. What do you think?
Abel put his heart into it, put more effort and thought into, giving God the best, whereby sort of Cain gave whatever he could get his hands on.
Okay. It doesn't really say that, but yes, Paul.
Yeah, it doesn't say, it says what Abel did.
Yeah.
But it didn't actually say what Cain didn't do it the same way as Abel. By sort of, I guess you've got to work from there, you can work out that he gave, but it seems like it's implicit that he gave out of duty of giving rather than wholeheartedness.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the silence was
The silence.
rather
Yeah.
than, what he didn't do rather than what he did,
Okay.
I
Charles.
think Abel more gave out of faith because your first fruit is the first thing you ever get. And the first animal, you don't know if the next one is going to give birth anymore.
Yeah.
Or this could be the end of it. But he just took his first and gave it. So that means it just depends on God, whatever follows. So it's just more out of faith because he doesn't know what the future holds.
Do you want to say something, Rob? Okay.
It says that Cain gave
Cain.
the son,
Yeah.
Abel gave fat portions.
He gave the best.
Gave the best. The key thing is the faith behind it. That's the key thing. Because in other passages, giving, whether it's part of your grains, there was that requirement as well in the Old Testament. But it's the faith behind it. It's the fact that I am giving this to God. with some kind of certainty that this is a gift to God. The attitude behind it was faithful. And that's, again, as we said, it's seen with the eyes of our hearts. And then we talk about Enoch. Obviously, I can't go through each one, but I would definitely encourage us to spend time to look at each, person that's mentioned here. And that's one of the questions we're actually even going to sort of answer. But by faith, it says Enoch was taken from this life. I mean, we don't really hear that many sermons on Enoch. There are a few verses, but what a life. I mean, he was 365 years old, young at his time, just went for a stroll and just never came back. And what was it? It says there, it was his faith. It was his faith that pleased God. And then the writer then goes on to tell us that, without faith, it is impossible. It's one of the few times where you see the word impossible going into almost a negative. Because it's saying that without faith, it is impossible to please God. And the type of faith it's talking about is a faith of certainty. Is a faith that this is not I believe in God, this is I believe God and I obey. And that challenges us, that challenges me, because it is not a religious faith. I just show up. And that's what Cain did. Showed up, I attend, but my heart is somewhere else. So let's just go through a few of the others. Noah, again, we know he built the ark. Again, we can sort of go down that whole story of he was building the ark through eyes of faith, the vision he saw in his own heart. There was no rain at the time, the way we know rain now. People would have been walking, but what are you doing, Mr. Noah? Don't worry, I'm building it. God has spoken. It took a lot of faith. Abraham. And there's a lot about Abraham there. And recently, just about 2 weeks ago, I was privileged to watch a film, actually free on YouTube. I can send you the link, on Abraham. Wonderful film. But sometimes when you see something like in a film, you sort of get an understanding of what it must have been like to just get up and leave your family, leave your whole culture, and just start going somewhere that you don't even know where you're really going. It's okay for us now to look at it and think, Abraham, father of faith. But at his time, what a challenge. What a challenge to stand up and say, God has spoken, I am going to go. And that film, there were some scenes in that film that really helped me to see that this wasn't easy. It wasn't easy because him and his little clan, they were just going into this wilderness and God has spoken. He didn't have the scriptures that we have. He heard the voice of God in his heart. There was no text. There's nobody else to say, what do you think? There was no spur one another on. It was him and God. Very, very impacting. And obviously we know about Sarah, etc. So obviously there's a lot in those verses. But just to remind ourselves of that the Hebrew writer, what he's doing, he's giving examples of the kind of faith that he wants the Jewish believers or the Jewish Christians to hold on to. If somebody could please read from verse 12 to 29. We'll soon be wrapping up. Yes, Rico, please.
And so, from this one man, and he as good as dead, came this.
Yeah, if you could, from verse 13, sorry.
All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. he who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the stock of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instruction about his bones. 29. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be ill-treated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not hurt the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned.
Okay, thank you very much. Wow, there's a lot in there, isn't there? So much. From verse 13, it says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. And that's one of the questions that we're going to answer, which is, do you consider yourself a pilgrim and an alien on the earth? How does this affect your priorities and actions? How should it affect them in deeper ways? You know, sometimes we could be so tied in to this side of life and forget that actually we are aliens, we're pilgrims just walking through. And having that perspective, as it says in Colossians 3, is so important. That's something that we can discuss. But I think it's interesting to note just briefly, you know, about Abraham's faith again, that he reasons that God was able to raise Isaac from the dead. I mean, there's some deep insights there, but when you link it to what the writer's trying to get across, that the death of Jesus, the atonement of Jesus is enough. You know, Jesus has risen from the dead, and if we believe in the same way Abraham believed, that is enough. You don't have to go back to your Jewish ways. That's what he's trying to get across, obviously. You know, he talks a lot about Moses as well. And it's interesting to note, if you've seen the film 10 Commandments, I think they do a great job in helping us see the kind of lavish life that Moses was living in the palace, and he had everything, and he gave that up. And it says in the scriptures here, you know, by faith, when he had grown up, he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. I mean, this is like being the son of a millionaire, you know, having all that inheritance, and then saying, nope, it's not for me. You know, he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. Yeah, you know, so there's been times for me where, you know, you want to sort of live a life. Let me just enjoy my life here. You know, let me go after the things that will give me pleasure and, you know, comfort and be comfortable. And then you realize that, no. You can have that for a short while, but then you lose the gift that God has for us for eternity. You know, so are we thinking about these things? Are we also looking forward to the reward? Verse 26. Because he was looking ahead to his reward. You know, do we see that God wants to reward us? Let's finish it off with from verse 30 to the end, if somebody could help us with that. Anyway. Yep, Elikim. Elikim, you've already read. Somebody else, please. Yes, Ebosa, thanks.
By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the sword, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle, and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Others who were tortured and refused to be released, so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned. They were sawed in two. They were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith. Yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect.
Wow. So the writer here is saying that all these people are waiting for us. It says there that, they were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. So for all these men and women of great faith, they were looking ahead. They were looking ahead of what God was going to do. And they believed it, and that's why, incredible stories there of different, people that we know, obviously, in the scriptures, people being sawn in two. Some people think that maybe is Isaiah. We know about David, and we know about Daniel. We know about Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. They didn't have anybody claiming to have risen from the dead. But they believed that God is able. And, for us, we are looking back. We have that truth that Jesus has risen from the dead. So they were looking forward, and we are looking back. But it's saying here in verse 40 that God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. So when we really look at this chapter, it's a very challenging chapter. Because when we read what first century Christians went ahead to go and do, when you read books like the Fox's Book of Martyrs, which I happened to have read about 3 weeks ago, I was just convicted to the core. Because you find out that in almost every century after Jesus' resurrection, Christians were being persecuted. And there's some graphic stories of people being skinned alive, peeled, and still saying Jesus is Lord. And it's very, very convicting about how I get a bit timid when it comes to sharing my faith or talking about Jesus. You understand? You get a bit timid that my life is not at threat. And what my brothers and sisters have gone through, so much more. And when we get to verse 12, yes, they're watching. They're a crowd of witnesses. So we're going to challenge ourselves. I really hope that we can, all of us, and me included, all of us, I think we do need to challenge ourselves a lot more on what kind of faith are we demonstrating. the questions that we're going to be answering, apart from the first one I read, is there a particular biblical character mentioned in chapter 11 with whom you identify and to whom you can look as a model for living by faith? Because that's what they're there for. It's called the Hall of Fame. If so, who is it, and how is that person a model for you in your situation? And how can you follow that model? Another question is there any circumstance in your life in which you need to trust God even though you can't see where it's all going to lead? What have you learned from chapter 11 that should make it easier for you to do this? That's why I said today hopefully it should help us apply the faith, not just talk about it academically. And then number 4, when your life is over, how would you want to be remembered? What legacy would you leave behind? If this was the time when the Bible was being written, would our names be in it? Not that we do things to get in it, but that our lives, there's something so unique about how we live that people have just got to write about it. And I think we have an opportunity in our lifetime to do something great for God. I really do believe that if we do create an environment where we are encouraging and spurring one another on, God can use us in a unique way so that our faith can be not only told about in our generation, but in the generations to come.